Thanks for joining us this morning to talk a little bit about teaching to our Generation Z. To kind of set us in the mood, I have a quick little video here to kind of remind you of where education began as we are facing all of the challenges with changing our pedagogy right now. But just to kind of get you thinking a little bit about the facilities and the layouts and how our classrooms have changed over the years, and to kind of allow you to kind of focus in on our discussion today and leave all those other stressors that you're coming from. I just finished teaching a class 2 minutes ago, so it'll give me a chance to take a breath as well. So have things changed a little bit since then? I think sometimes it's good to remember where we started, that now instead of having to stoke up the potbelly stove, we're flipping on a switch to turn on the computer so we can start our teaching. I have personally found, I did a mid-semester evaluation with my students to kind of get a sense of how our remote classes were going. And they were saying, could you add in some videos? Could you do some Kahoot, trying to add some more fun things. So I started about 3 weeks ago adding a little video snippet like this to the beginning of my classes. So I arrive a couple minutes early, I can turn things on, get my PowerPoints all set up, and I can have this video running so that as students join into the class, they can be checking that they can see things, that their microphones are hearing, everything's working properly, and it kind of sets that stage for whatever our topic of the day is. So it gives me kind of that visual representation to refer back to. And I was noticing a lot of my students were sliding in very last minute or a couple of minutes late. So it also is kind of encouraging them to arrive a couple minutes early because they know I'm going to be referring back to that video. So, and occasionally I have timed it such so that, my class starts at 9:30. So an important fact in the video is showing at 9:31, and then I'm quizzing them on that later in the class. So they're accountable for everything from the start of class itself. So that idea that things are changing and how we're teaching, think about your classroom spaces and how those have adjusted over the last, we'll say 5 years perhaps, as we've added more active classroom spaces at BGSU. And then obviously what we're dealing with right now with the pandemic as we have our hybrid classes, the all online remote classes, or even just the online classroom itself, how that space does impact what we do. So we always need to be kind of cognizant of those spaces in our teaching, the lecture hall versus a traditional classroom, um, any other kind of configurations that we may be coming up with. And as that space change, is it changing your expectations of your students? Do you think they have a different expectation of you now than they did a few years ago?
Yes, I think so. I think that they have higher expectations than they ever did before.
And to the degree that our classroom spaces have changed in the past few years, think about what their K through 12 experience have looked like. What kind of classroom environments are they coming to us from? What are they used to having in terms of amenities in the classroom itself, in terms of computer and technology, the interaction they may be having with their faculty members as they're advancing into those high school classes? It's really starting to set an expectation for what they want from us when they arrive here. So again, for those of you who don't know me, I am Karen Ebach. I am a teaching professor in the Department of Management in the Schmidt-Horst College of Business. The presentation that I'm giving is really kind of a modification of one that Katie Sabata and I did last year at the Decision Science Institute. So I want to thank Katie for her input into this. And CATL, we were trying to do in our presentation to kind of give some publicity to what our CATL organization, and that's our committee for teaching and learning in the College of Business, trying to advance the innovations and kind of help spread the word of some things that are being done right in the classroom so that others can adapt those. What we want to talk about real quickly here today is kind of looking at those generational differences, especially the difference between Gen Y and Gen Z, or the millennials, and what we're seeing right now. What are some things that we can be doing to teach that Generation Z, our current students, and some of those innovations and successful techniques that have been used? And again, I'd like to try to make this interactive. So, unmute, raise your hand. Let me make sure I've got my chat window up so that if you put something in, that you'll be able to make a question or comment there as well. And we'll try to keep track of all that as we go through. Basically, here's the official guidelines for when the birth years are of the different generations. I am part of the baby boomers generation. Yes, I'm old, but I don't mentally associate with that. So a lot of the characteristics, and I'll say the bad mouthing you see of baby boomers, I really want to say, oh no, that's them, that's not me. So as you look at these generations, recognize this is kind of the catch-all for everyone, but each person who's born in those range has individual characteristics. So just because you're a baby boomer doesn't mean you assimilate to all those characteristics. So Gen X is probably a lot of you as faculty as well, kind of born in the 60s and 70s. Gen Y then is the millennials. They're coming of age during that change into 2000. And then our Gen Z are the ones born since 95 into 92. So they're the ones that we're seeing in class consistently now. And the idea is each of these cohorts are based off of kind of what's going on in the world around us and how that impacts our perceptions. So as baby boomers, you're being brought up in this age of consumerism after, the generation ahead had all the depression and World War II rationing and things. So it's a very different mindset of what's going on. Gen X, The Vietnam War is there, but they don't really have a lot of memory of some of that information. They're kind of, as the world's changing and things are becoming more global in nature, millennials start to get the touch of some of the computerization. With the millennials, it's really seen as the age of lost innocence. They're the ones that really are aware of the whole 9/11, Columbine shootings. They kind of brought up as those things were happening in the environment. So it really kind of impacted their perceptions. A couple economic collapses, so times aren't always good. Parents were really trying to help students navigate through these changes. With our term of helicopter parents, a lot of the participation ribbons, trying to encourage that self-esteem. We saw that in a lot of students, that very entitled type of a mindset. And this is very different than what the current generation has, that their perceptions are very different in terms of the world and what they are brought up in. They've always known school shootings. They've always known that kind of domestic terrorism, violence. They've seen economy going up and down. That's just kind of the fact of life for them. This idea of climate change, whether, the argument of whether it's real or not, it's always been part of their discussions, that kind of environmental reform. But technology has always been there as well. They never really knew a world that didn't have the cell phone and the internet. So technology is very second nature. And what we're finding is that in this Gen Z, because of this kind of awareness of the world around them, there's much more drive to be incorporated with it, to try to make a difference. You see a lot more that are looking to try to be a part of those social movements. They tend to work hard, but they also expect to get acknowledged for it. So there's this motivation to work hard, to self-start, that you're going to get rewarded for what you put into it. And there's a motivation to plan for their future. And I think that's something that's a little bit different, that there is kind of this view looking forward. How do we make things better going forward? How do we make those improvements? Some of you may have kids in this generation. So, kind of seeing what the world looks like through their eyes and their perceptions, you recognize that it may be different than your own upbringing. I think sometimes our kids are our best markers of, what's current and what's good, to try to get those feedback and incorporate it. So the idea is teaching to Gen Z. They really want to be engaged, and they're looking for the immediate feedback. They want to know if they're on the right track. They're used to technology where it's always instant, always on. But they also want to know that what they're learning, there's some relevance to it. It's not some abstract concept, that it's something that can actually be applied. And we still have all these different learning styles out there. So we want to make sure that as we're teaching to Gen Z, we're aware of those differences, and we're hitting a lot of different pedagogy. So we're using that visual, audio, kinesics. We're coming up with all those different kind of components to engage them at different levels. When I started teaching, one of the things that I found very insightful, and something I try to incorporate on a regular basis, is that every 5 to 7 minutes, you should change what you're doing, to try to re-engage them into the classroom. So maybe you talk for 5 minutes and then you ask a question and you pause to let them respond, or you throw in that video, or you even it's just changing the voice quality. You talk softer so they have to lean in a little further. You do something every 5 to 7 minutes to kind of break it up, so it just isn't that kind of monotone conversation that going on. So using all the different technologies can be a tool to help us do that. We can use those videos, those pictures, those clips. We can have some music in the background. I mean, hopefully that music in the background, that little video I was showing at the start, it's kind of mellow and kind of, calms you down a little bit and puts you in a different mindset. So now our big challenge is, how do we take even baseline knowledge of teaching and move it across all these different venues where we've got face-to-face to online, these hybrid, remote. We want to use these high impact teaching practices across all these different kind of configurations to make the best experience for our students. So knowing we've only got a limited amount of time, I don't know, Steve, were you able to load up the Zoom poll that I had sent you? No? All right. So we were trying to use that logic of let's break things up a few minutes in. We're going to try to do a Zoom poll, but since I wasn't the owner of this one, I couldn't get it preloaded. But basically wanted to kind of get a sense of what environments are you currently operating in? So maybe we can just do, here, we'll go back to that last slide. If we say 1, 2, 3, 4, can you hold up fingers for me? If the majority of your classes, I guess will probably be mostly 2s, 3s, and 4s, but if the majority of your classes are hybrid, if you'll hold up, the 2 fingers, if they're mostly remote, 3, online, 4. Okay. So I'm seeing mostly that we're kind of in this hybrid remote kind of a range, which creates some different challenges. All right. This might take a lot of hands and fingers. I was going to try to get you to kind of figure out which of these topics are the ones that are most critical that we've only got a limited amount of time. Which of these would you like to hear about first? So I don't know if I can go in.
You could use the chat and just vote in the chat.
We can?
I'm saying like we could all just list the thing in the chat.
Tell me which one's the most pressing need. Thanks, Jerry, for that suggestion. Okay. Polling, academic honesty, community-based, groups and teams, polling, all of the above. All right. All right, well, let me start with academic honesty. That seems like the first one. Then we've got some community-based and polling. So maybe we'll end up kind of going through. This is another trick with PowerPoint. If you haven't discovered this already, you can hyperlink to different slides. So as you're going through, I actually have it set up so I can jump to my page based on what you said, and then have a little link that I put into the bottom corner that'll allow me to return to that main menu to move through. So as you're talking a number of topics with your students, if you're not sure where they have questions, you can kind of, again, use that polling to get their opinions and be able to tailor your presentation to the needs of the class. So from academic honesty, do you have particular questions or concerns, things that you've run into? Got a couple of bullets here on the slide, but.
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in it. I guess in the teaching that I do, it's kind of hard to do algorithmic problems or multiple choice and all that. I'm trying to get students to build a model, which maybe I just need to stop assessing that ability, but that's the way we've done it for the time I've been here. And so you're basically building a problem for 50 minutes on an exam. And the reason I've never wanted to go online is because how do you police that? And so I'm remote, and out of 80 students, I had 9 people submit basically the same file on the first exam. So that was not fun. I'm not even looking for it, but it's kind of hard to miss sometimes when people do the same work. It's like people all painting a painting, and these paintings all look like the same painting. Anyway.
Yeah, so I teach an Excel-based class, so I kind of run into the same issue that I'm testing by, here's an Excel spreadsheet and here's a list of directions that they have to kind of follow. What I have found is making sure that the Excel document that they're working off of, so that kind of initial template, I have updated it so that all the properties associated with it are unique to this class and this semester. I found my bigger academic honesty problem tended to be students last semester passing on their information to the next semester. So making sure that I constantly kind of tweak those problems. I change the data points a little bit, we'll change the directions a little bit, and change the baseline document itself. And looking at the properties, I can also see who was the last author of that. I found a situation actually with the help of ITS. We caught a student last semester who was actually paying somebody in India to take his exams for him. So they have software where they can track when a student has multiple windows open. they have certain sites that they have flagged as suspicious. So this was one that the student had contacted them, basically given them his login information to download information off of Canvas. They then were doing all the work and uploading it again. Ironically, he didn't do well on the exam either. But of course, once we recognized the cheating, it was even worse. But there was a number of things lost in translation. So there is some technology that's there to support in our ITS system. People there are really good about trying to track some of those really big issues. The smaller ones, you know, it's paying attention to those details, the cutting and pasting, watching for those kind of little unique characteristics. I've gone to a textbook. The Pearson book that I'm using for my class actually has the MyLab IT. So it actually provides each student with a unique identifier for their spreadsheet. They work on an assignment and load it up. So it's verifying that they're the one that actually did the work on a day-to-day basis. So a lot of the textbooks have really come up with good tools to help us kind of at least make sure that they're learning and they're gathering the information along the way. Maybe our examination is not as valid as we had hoped in the past. But I would argue even when we're face-to-face, students have always found a way to work the system. And I guess I kind of came to the realization that my ability to police, 80 students in a crowded classroom that nobody's looking over at their neighbor's paper really isn't that much different than 80 students taking an exam online.
Karen, I have a question about, have you ever tried having everyone do a test at the same time, being online at the same time? Like, for instance, if I have an exam where they're writing a message, having everyone on at the same time, I know that I'm going to get one or two students who are going to say, well, I have terrible Wi-Fi right now. So have you done that? And if so, how has it worked for you?
So I've actually taken the other approach. I create pools of questions. So I have chosen to go with the one question at a time kind of a model as opposed to having the web camera on. I've been reading a lot of information about how that camera can slow the streaming of it, can create problems. So I have chosen, they get one question at a time. They have to answer it before moving on to the next. I'll have a pool of 10 questions. Each student gets randomly 3 or 4 out of that pool. So each person gets a slightly different exam, but I'll actually open it up for a 24-hour period to kind of let them pick their best operating time. But my classroom time is one of the times available. So everyone should have time to take the exam itself. There has been a lot of streaming issues that have occurred this semester because of the number of people using technology. I know on my first exam in my supply chain class, I have some diagrams and I had a number of students who were using Safari. So particularly with Mac problems, they weren't able to see some of the diagrams that were needed to answer questions. Once we kind of identified that as an issue in my directions, I can now say, make sure you're on Google Chrome or Firefox. Those seem to be the most compatible. Make sure that's the browser you're using, that you cleared all your cache and cookies before starting. So it's kind of giving them that warm up. Here's the things to do to make sure your computer is working at its optimal capacity before you get started. And I think from there, you can manage the exceptions.
Thank you.
So, and I also will use time limits for the exam itself because I don't want them looking up every individual question. I tell them to prepare as if it was a face-to-face. I give them about class amount of time to take that online exam. So they know they've got, 75, 90 minutes, 50 minutes to take the test. So there's a little bit of pressure for them to continue to move forward as well. But the idea with using that technology is good for our Generation Z students is because it does create that immediate feedback. When they finish a Canvas-based test, the majority of it's already pre-graded, depending on how many essays or other things you've got in it. There is integrity in the process in terms of the accuracy of it. You get a lot of metrics downloaded from Canvas about the difficulty of the individual items to make sure that the exams were comparable, to be able to review, was there a bad question, and to make those kinds of adjustments. I think polling was one of the other ones. There's a lot of tools for polling. Zoom has one built in that you can do, and that's one that you can actually kind of pre-write. They have a template to be able to create the questions and be able to upload them in to be able to use with your courses. Kahoot has some features that you can use to try to get some feedback through. Top Hat, MindTap, or other softwares. I know in the College of Business, Ruth White has sort of headed the Kahoot for us to be able to use.
WebEx has it as well.
Okay, so WebEx has the functionality.
Yeah.
So again, the idea is to try to get some feedback and to try to get some interaction in. It's a great way to kind of validate, are you with me? Are you not? Asking some questions. Again, from a Gen Z standpoint, it's digital, it's immediate feedback, and it allows that instructor to kind of gauge where you are to be able to adjust in the teaching as you go forward. So I was using Kahoot, just really started using that in the last few weeks. Have appreciated that, I can put in a question. I'm going through it in class where we're going kind of a question at a time. It immediately gives me results in terms of the percent of people who got the right answer versus wrong answers. I can debrief question by question of, okay, here's why I understand why you probably went to answer B when it should have been answer A. Here's the difference between those two to make sure they understand, those subtleties. I can throw in those applications for them to start to recognize what the examinations are going to look like. With the online exams, I really stay away from those kind of term definition questions. I want applications. I want that higher level of learning. I also want situations that they can't Google during the middle of a test. So, going back to that accuracy. So the Kahoot, Top Hat, WebEx, those all give you the tools to kind of do that pre-assessment and kind of keep up as you're going through. I don't know if you're like me, I tend to be teaching right now to a lot of names. Not a lot of people are sharing their screens, so it's a good way for me to try to gauge some of the feedback too. Let's see, gamification. This is one that Katie's been really good at doing. Going over theory you're studying with a problem or case, having some time challenge for them to try to come up with solutions. I've used scavenger hunts in my classes. Here's your annual report. Go find these pieces of information. As they find this piece, I may ask a question for them to find the next, trying to give that real Kahoot. Top Hat, I think, kind of do that too, that they have a leaderboard to kind of show you who's ahead. So you have this kind of competition to be able to answer quickly and accurately. But again, it engages the student, so that Gen Z student wants to be engaged. It's pulling them in, creates that kind of excitement. And we can also use that then to kind of bring theory into actual practice to see those kinds of applications. Any of you tried to play games with your students? Did they enjoy that when you do that though? To the degree that you can kind of come up with I've even done in the old-fashioned face-to-face class, kind of that last man standing quiz bowl type of thing, where I have given them a set of cards that have A, B, C, D on them, and we'll ask a question, and they have to stand up and say, I think it's answer A, and everybody who got it right remains standing. Everybody else sits down. Trying to create some physical engagement. Doing those different kinesiology type of kinetics in their learning. We did polling. Let me go back again. Let's see. Community-based learning. This is one I really like. This is engaging the students with partners out in the community. And oftentimes they have problems that even beginning students have the skills to be able to address and be able to help with. We can work with local businesses. I am finding a lot of success right now in people volunteering to be guest speakers into classes. It's really convenient for them to hop onto a Zoom call for a half hour, a lot more convenient than them driving 3 hours to get to campus. So they're much more willing. In fact, advising a student organization, we've got an overabundance of people who are volunteering to come to our group meetings. But it really helps students to see that it's not just you talking a bunch of gobbledygook theory out here in space, but it's actually stuff that's important and actually works, and it actually here's what it looks like in practice. Students have a chance to engage. When you're working with companies, they really appreciate getting in front of students to get their company name known. And if you work with not-for-profit organizations, they really appreciate having somebody volunteer to help. I've done a number of service learning projects or community-based learning projects where I send my students out to help not-for-profit organizations in the area. I've used this with a principles of management class, which is students from across the university. So it's not just business students, it's students in architecture and College of Technology and tourism and leisure, interior design, kind of from all different kinds of backgrounds. And I have them form a group to go out and find a project to work with a not-for-profit organization where they can utilize their skills. So I had a group of VCT students go in and create a 2-minute video for the Bowling Green group on aging. I've had construction technology students go and build a ramp for the Common Good organization here in town. So they're using their skills to help an organization. It gives them something practical to talk about in their interview situations. They see again how their learning connects. Their goal in that project was really to manage the process, to learn their management skills. It also exposed them to other organizational cultures. So as they get ready to leave BGSU, this student needs to understand that there's a lot of different companies and cultures and expectations out there. So the more we can expose them to that, they can start to kind of get a sense of what their preferences are. What are they looking for? What is that degree of social responsibility that's out there? Is this company one that encourages their employees to work for Habitat for Humanity or gives them time off to have that kind of social impact? Is it all about the profit? They can kind of get a sense of all the different organizations that occur. Does that answer the questions or things that you had? So again, I've gotten spreadsheets from organizations that's full of really messy data that I can use for my Excel class so they can see what it looks like when it's not me just putting together some nice little spreadsheet. When it's really big and really messy, it gets a lot more fun. Let's see, I think we had teams, and there was one of the other ones. There are still a lot of opportunities to use groups and teams, even in our kind of virtual hybrid environments. Think, pair, share is kind of that quick one where you kind of turn to a partner and chat. You can create a lot of different breakout groups using some of the software in Zoom. Yeah, Steve, you got a question?
Yeah, so I was curious about kind of intersection of the community, teams, and gamification. And I do this exercise. I'm just curious if you would adapt it or how you change it. I do this thing I call the Iron Chef experience, where they get put into teams immediately. They don't know who their team is, and then they have a task, and they don't know what the secret ingredient is, what the task is, the problem is, and then it's time based, and they get a set of information. They have to use the tools that they've been learning in service of. They have to start practicing it, and it creates a bit of intensity in terms of there's a competitive nature because there's a winner. There is time-based. They got to work quickly together, and there's all kinds of other things happening. What would you do with something like that to make sure it fits for them?
Well, I think it sounds like a great exercise that you're using. It kind of incorporates all those different pieces. So I think what we're doing now is using kind of that breakout room as our surrogate for creating those groups unknown. I use a lot of the Zoom. I found that was most intuitive for me to be using for my remote classes. That you can be sending little messages to your group, so you could kind of unveil those secret ingredients and those different pieces as you go along with sending I want to say they gave you what, like 200 characters to comment into the breakout rooms. Give them a few minutes to say hello. When I do groups, if I know I'm going to use that group consistently throughout the semester, I'll want to make sure that they actually go through Tuckman stages of that group development. So we want to make sure that we have formed. I'll have them take the time to kind of talk to each other about what are your skill sets. So I think them having a chance to kind of get to know some other people in the class. Here's what I'm good at. Here's what I'm not. From a business perspective, we'll talk about SWOT analysis for organizations. So it's kind of a mini SWOT analysis for the teams. What are your strengths and weaknesses as a group? So what are you going to be able to be really good at, and what are going to be your weak points, those threats that you're going to need to watch out for? Give them a couple of those little smaller tasks so they get a chance to figure out how they make decisions and how they're going to work together. One of the little tasks I give them is actually to write out a contract of what their expectations is for group performance. So they're going to use all their previous group and team experience to say, this worked well, this was horrible. Let's take that into account and say, this is what we expect from each other. And I'll make them do that, kind of like what you were saying, Steve, before they know what the task is itself. So before I've told them what I'm going to use this group to do, they've had to come up with kind of, here's our generic contract of what it means to be a good team member. We're going to be on time. We're going to communicate well with each other. We're going to be give positive feedback. All those type of things that we want to kind of encourage in a group to do.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. And I do that in one situation. I think by necessity I had to do it. I didn't think about it actually being a good idea. In terms of having them get organized before they know what they're going to work on. Because and I just needed to do it because of the time, the sequence of timing. So get ready and then you're going to go. So that's pretty interesting. And then what I find is also interesting is teaching them how important group organizing skills are and group contracting and stuff like that as a side skill to the topic that we're studying.
Yeah, so when I'm doing my community-based learning, this is the first step. Before I tell them what that project's going to be out in the community, they're forming their groups. They're going through this kind of forming, storming, and norming aspect of it. And really, Tuckman says that we have to go through those stages before we can perform at our maximum capacity. So I don't want them distracted and trying to jump immediately into that performing stage. I want them to have to go through kind of this iteration to get to it. So you've got a project you're going to work on together, but you're not going to get the details until I know you're ready as a team to take that step.
I like how you framed that. That's good. That's awesome, Karen.
So the other part of that contract is also recognizing they're accountable for the success or failure of the team as a whole. So they need to incorporate in that, what are the rewards? What are the consequences for behavior? So if someone's not showing up on time, what is that group going to do about it? It's not, we're going to report you to the instructor. It's, what are your mechanisms to improve and change behaviors? So that kind of helps them learn, again, that idea of self-management. And we also, the other important part with using groups and teams is to make sure there is a final reflection, that it's talking about the process of the group as a whole, not necessarily a reflection on the tasks that you had assigned, but what was their experience with working with the other people? What, again, kind of, I like to talk about the good, the bad, the ugly. So we want to kind of gather that information so that you've reflected on it. So when you go into that next experience, you have some metrics in mind. You have some ideas of, here's some good practices. Here's what I want to encourage my next group to do. And here's what I want to try to avoid as we set things up. Again, from a Gen Z standpoint, it's really providing them with those mechanisms for engagement, to get some feedback from their peers and how they're working on the items themselves. So allows us to focus on those weak points, get them actually. And again, the key really is that engagement. And that's really what we've been talking about with a lot of the pedagogy right now, is how do we get them actively engaged? We want these active learning classrooms. We want to use this kind of flipped classroom design. And the idea that all this stuff that we're having to develop right now for these hybrid and remote classes really puts us on that fast track for that flipped classroom. You've got the pieces of information there. You've got a lot of the components set up that when you get to meet face-to-face with your entire class again, somewhere in the future, hopefully that will happen, you're going to have a lot of tools at your disposal to use. And in the meantime, we're learning a lot about the technology and how this generation adapts and uses it. I find each piece of new technology I've been picking up becomes a little more intuitive. I'm a little more comfortable navigating myself around. I'm not as afraid that I'm going to blow things up. So that comfort level starts to grow the more that we engage.
Aaron, I have a
question for you about, you had mentioned that now when you do remote, you don't have students that have their video on. So do you have suggestions for us to engage them? They need to be engaged with us. So do you have any tips or tricks on how you get them to turn their videos on and keep them on?
So I guess I have come to the realization that having a video on is not necessarily a good thing. So in the first weeks of this semester, I was, asking students to turn on their videos, and what I was finding was a lot of really distracting visuals. That I was getting a lot of roommates coming in behind. I had one that took some kind of stuffed animal that's going zooming in and out in the screen, um, you know, just and other people that are getting up and walking away, and all you're seeing is an empty room. So to me, seeing that really wasn't helping the engagement of the class. And those with the little black screens were communicating with me just as much, if not more. So I kind of took the step back from it. So if I can create activities where they're participating along, I can use the Kahoot, I could use a Zoom poll, I can use things like that to make sure I pull them back in again, I'm probably closer to a 15 or 20 minute than that 7-minute standard just because of the technology and trying to get things through. But I typically have a handout that they have to download for class each day. We're going to work together and kind of fill it out. They have an accountability where I'm going to have them submit something each class. So I'm trying to create that kind of reinforcement. In a face-to-face class, I was using a daily quiz that would kind of be the notes I wanted to make sure they all took for the class. Here's the information I want to make sure you walked away with. And I'd put that in the form of a daily quiz that they self-graded, and they would turn in each day. And that was sort of my attendance and my reward for being here and participating. So from a virtual standpoint, I've kind of created that same equivalency of here's this task that we're going to work on today. If you complete this task and upload it for me, I'm going to know that you collected the key points, my learning outcomes for the day. And the same really goes with using Teams is you need to make sure that there's some accountability. So having that time limit or having some sort of documentation that the team has to report out at the end to make sure that they've stayed on task and they're getting the work accomplished. So I think that accountability becomes kind of that surrogate to ensure that they were engaged and alive through the
and Karen, what I like that you said that was important, I think, is that there's a lot of ideals, like things that we would ideally like to have. And I'm coming to the conclusion there's a hierarchy of practices. There's those things you really have to make sure you do. And then there's another set of things that that you can do if you have those things done, but you've got to focus on some things first. In the video piece, I would like them to do that. I just try to reinforce it. But I think your point was make sure you got the activities that you're engaging them, that you're making sure that they have to stay engaged in different ways. And then at some point you could work on ideas, because I would love to figure out how to get them really having a good background, knowing how to manage their environment, because those are new skills that they're going to have as well for remote work. But I do agree with you on the focusing on what's most important and letting go of some of the stuff, because you can't be perfect with all of it.
Well, and there's, like I said, there's been a lot of writings on the K through 12 environment and how having the videos on really highlights some of the economic disparities of students and participants. And I think we're here to focus on the learning, not to focus on what one person has versus someone else doesn't have. Or, I don't need 5 students emailing me at the start of each class or chatting in the chat telling me my camera's broke. I don't care. Do what's best for you. Do what it's going to take for you to stay engaged. If having the video on is what you have found is more productive for you to stay engaged so you're not constantly on your phone or something else, then turn the video on. But I think it's important for us to recognize that not all of our students are in ideal situations, and not all of our students have the financial resources to really create a quiet room or to have the best Wi-Fi or a really up-to-date computer. I know last spring the university worked at trying to loan out computers to students to make sure they had the resources. So we're trying to level the playing field, but we got to meet the students where they are. And I think that goes to some of the diversity and inclusion initiatives that we're seeing, and really kind of keeping that in mind as we program our classes as well.
Karen, I had a question related to the camera issue that we've been talking about for a few minutes here, the breakout session, do you encourage students to at least turn their camera on when they're talking to like a partner or a small team? I don't know. I haven't tried the breakout yet, but I'm toying with that. And I've been really inspired in the last 10 or 15 minutes about flipping the classroom, using, Steve mentioned Iron Chef. I've never watched that show, but my niece, who's an iGen, showed me this show called Nailed It, where you're trying to bake a cake. And I always use that analogy in my spreadsheet classes. Like, it's kind of like we're baking a cake, and did you nail it or not? I could see I could do a lot of gamification around that. Like flipping the classroom, you watched a video, now let's do a simpler example that we normally do in class, just because it's simple. And I could really see that happening. So I guess I had a couple thoughts there. I hope I didn't run on too long. But the main question, the first question was, do you encourage like cameras on during the breakouts?
So probably my biggest frustration right now is trying to figure out how to create Zoom breakout groups that are assigned for the entire semester. That because a lot of our students had Zoom accounts prior to BGSU adapting it, their accounts are not necessarily tied to their BGSU email addresses. And if they haven't registered for the class using their BGSU email, they can't be uploaded and linked into a permanent Zoom room. So right now I'm just using Zoom's random breakout room assignments, and I'm not sure what WebEx's mechanics are. So I just randomly assign based on how many people have showed up for my class into groups. Usually one class, I'm usually around 5 to 6 is where I try to keep the group size so that there can be some conversations going on. I'll pop in to kind of see how they're going and to see if they've got any questions and to make sure that they're working. I tend to find a lot of disparity in how people are behaving in those groups. The feedback I got from my one class is I really love the breakout groups because it forces me to be a leader, to kind of, be the one in charge, and it's given me some great skills to try to encourage the participation of others. And I had just as many people saying, I hate breakout groups, no one ever talks, and I don't see any value in it. So you've got this dichotomy, and I think it was useful for me to share that feedback with my class as well, for them to see that we have different perceptions of what's good and bad. And as we're trying to hit a lot of different mechanics, sometimes you're going to love it, sometimes you're going to hate it. But we have this mix so everyone has that chance to love or hate something. So I can encourage them to turn on their cameras. I am much more concerned that they've turned on their mics, they're not muted so that they can have a conversation. Baby steps, type of thing. But again, depending on how I'm using that group, if I'm assigning them a task that they have to complete together, then there is motivation for them to share that information and talk. They have gotten much better at sharing screens. So again, I don't think they want to see each other necessarily, but they'll pull up that worksheet or that spreadsheet to be able to work on collaboratively. They'll share that kind of a screen view instead. And I think that's great. I'm all for that.
I think one thing that's vitally important for breakout rooms is that what you expect them to accomplish in the breakout room is made clear. I find that sharing a document where it's actually written out in text is the best thing. And I do that because I've heard feedback from students who complained about breakout rooms in other classes where the teacher's sort of going on, and then she says, okay, good. So now I'm going to put you in breakout rooms and I want you to discuss that. And they go, wait, what were we supposed to do? So what I keep hearing students say is that I don't like breakout rooms because usually we get into the breakout rooms and we ask each other, what was it that we were supposed to do? So
it's the pop quiz version. The pop breakout room is not a good model, right?
Right.
Totally is.
Cold call. Well, what?
Well, and even cold calling in the class, I would usually find myself, I'd ask the question and I'd say the name, and then I'd need to repeat the question because, you're kind of half listening, but you're not really listening until you hear your name and you kind of, sit up and wake up. So I agree totally. I have found that same thing, Jerry, that I tried to, have a slide. Here's what you need to go off and do. But then as soon as I send them into rooms, they no longer can see that slide. So kind of once I realized that they lost that direction sheet is when I recognized, okay, let me create that assignment on Canvas. I can put that direction on Canvas. I can put that worksheet that they need to fill out, and then they can upload it. So that's where
Yeah, that's an excellent idea. I've tried it a couple of ways. I've created Google Docs and assigned them to groups so that I can pop in and see what they're working on in the Google Docs. Lately, I use Microsoft Teams for my classes, which makes this sort of thing very easy.
Yeah, so I think that's the comfort level of the technologies and trying to figure out which is the best one to use based on what you're trying to accomplish.
So
I'm really pleased to see the direction of this conversation, because students with their cameras on and engagement, I think a lot about this, especially because I've sort of helped some other teachers develop more engaging online learning activities. And I see that especially when people are going off into a lecture, the students typically will turn off their cameras, and then who knows what they're doing. And they're if they're engaged in it, they're probably spacing off, and they're probably playing on their phones and probably doing. So your suggestion, Karen, I think is so on point. One, to change things up a lot, and two, to be very cognizant and what I'm hearing is overcompensate to make things that much more engaging. I think we have to do that, because face to face, you can make eye contact and ask questions, but if people's cameras are off, you don't have that. So even from an instructor's perspective, it's kind of it's disheartening, but I think it's something you can get used to ask a rhetorical question and wait for the response, and there's no response because students, it's unmuting your microphone and then making the point. That's a lot of extra effort.
So there's also the dramatic pause. So when you ask that question, counting mentally to 10 or 15, ask the question again and kind of say, hey, I'm waiting for an answer, to let them know. The issue is that, even in a face-to-face class, you may always have the same 5 people who want to answer everything. So it's trying to make sure that answer, the cold calling, if you will, done remotely. Stephen, did you have a question? Because I think we probably are coming up an hour here of your time. So we want to try to wrap things up.
Well, no, I had to leave I had an advising meeting. So I don't know if you talked about this, but what I've done so I've done the create an assignment and work on it in breakout rooms, but I've also done, I stole this idea from, I can't remember, from someone. Anyway, I created not a Google Doc, but a Google slideshow, basically the Google PowerPoint, Google Sheet, Google Slides it's called. And I put the instructions on one slide, and then and then I put them into breakout rooms, and each breakout room has a slide, and they need to do something on that slide, summarize what they're talking about, or have an activity where they have to do actually stuff on there. And again, so it has the instructions there that they can see, but also it lets me, like, I can be in that, it's one document, it's one website, and I can scroll through and I can see that everyone's making progress on it, and I can monitor them in real time to see that they're actually doing it. And if they're not, I can pop into their room and say, oh, hey, it looks like you guys are struggling. You guys haven't done this part yet. Is there anything I can, do you have any questions? Can I help you out? So, so that real time ability, allows me, is what like I said, I use Google Slides, and I can, I can show you. I can show you exactly what I've done, but but I think that kind of works well for group work, personally.
That's great. That's great. Great suggestions. Yeah. So Katie and I are going to be presenting again on this topic to Decision Science Institute DSI in November. They always do their conference right before Thanksgiving, and they made the decision this summer it was going to be a virtual conference. So we know it's going to be a virtual presentation. But as you have things that you've done that have worked, I'd be really appreciative if you shoot me an email and just kind of give me the highlights of what it is, so we kind of incorporate and kind of share some of the good practices that are being developed and some of the insights and innovations that we're doing here to keep our students engaged and learning and progressing during this pandemic environment. But thank you all very much for coming today and being here. Let me know if you've got any questions, and I appreciate it.
Thanks, Karen. It was awesome.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Karen. That's great.
Thank you very much, Karen.
Thank you all.